Imagine you are standing on Jerusalem's walls as the sun bleeds out across the desert. Your lips are cracked. Your throat tastes like rust and fear. Below you, 40,000 men move like a living sea, armor clinking, banners snapping, horses screaming. And behind you, there are barely 60 knights. Not real knights. Not trained warriors. Not men born for this. But bakers. Blacksmiths. Boys who were knights only minutes ago, knights in name alone. And the man leading them? A single exhausted noble who never wanted this command. Balian of Ibelin. You look down at Saladin's army. You look back at the city full of women and children. And you realize something horrifying. This isn't a siege. It's an execution. So here's the impossible question that should not have an answer. How did 60 fake knights humiliate the greatest general of the medieval world, and force mercy from a man who had none to give? Stay with me. Because the truth is darker, and far more terrifying than legend ever told. You think you know the siege of Jerusalem. You don't. What you're about to hear is not the polished, heroic version. This is the version that smells like sweat and rot. The version where men scream prayers through broken teeth. The version history tried to soften, because the real one is too unsettling. Over the next hour, you're going to witness 5 moments that sound like lies. First, how Balian turned ordinary civilians into knights in less than an hour, and why that single act made hardened veterans physically recoil. Second, the psychological weapon that made Saladin hesitate, just long enough for Jerusalem to breathe again. Third, the moment the city should have fallen, when even Balian believed everything was lost, and what he did instead that shocked both armies into silence. Fourth, the hidden betrayal inside Jerusalem that almost handed the city to Saladin without a fight. And finally, the negotiation so brutal, so morally twisted, that even Saladin's closest commanders begged him to stop. And when it's over, you'll understand why Jerusalem did not burn in 1187, and why the man who saved it vanished into history like a ghost. But first, you need to feel the despair. Jerusalem, 1187. The city is already dying before the siege even begins. The streets stink of sickness and old blood. Food is rationed down to crumbs. Water is measured in sips, not cups. Most of the real knights are gone. Dead at Hattin. Captured. Executed. The survivors, those who stumbled back into Jerusalem, carry hollow eyes and broken spirits. They've seen what Saladin does to defeated armies. They've watched friends kneel. They've heard the blades sing. And now they're here, trapped behind walls that suddenly feel very thin. Inside the city are nearly 60,000 civilians. Women clutching children. Old men who can barely walk. Refugees who fled here believing Jerusalem was untouchable. They were wrong. Because Balian of Ibelin never planned to be here. Balian wasn't supposed to defend Jerusalem. He wasn't supposed to command anything. He had asked Saladin for safe passage, just to retrieve his wife and children. Saladin granted it. A man of honor, to another man of honor. Balian swore an oath. He would not raise arms. He would not fight. And then he walked into a city already screaming for a leader. The patriarch begged him. The nobles begged him. The people begged him. They grabbed his hands. They knelt in the streets. They cried, "Don't leave us." And in that moment, Balian understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If he left, Jerusalem would not fall. It would be butchered. So he broke his oath. And the moment Saladin heard of it, the rules of mercy began to dissolve. Now imagine the weight of that decision. Every death from this point forward would sit on Balian's soul. And Saladin knew it. He marched on Jerusalem not in rage, but in certainty. He had crushed the Crusader armies. He had decapitated their leadership. He believed Jerusalem would surrender the moment his banners appeared on the horizon. Then he saw the walls manned. Then he saw flags flying. Then he heard the bells. And something felt wrong. Because Balian did something insane. He looked at the city's population, terrified, starving, untrained, and made a choice no medieval commander was supposed to make. He created knights. Not by merit. Not by lineage. But by desperation. 60 men were pulled forward. Some were merchants. Some were craftsmen. One had never held a sword in his life. Balian knelt before them. And he dubbed them knights. The blade touched their shoulders. The words were spoken. And just like that, Jerusalem's last line of defense was born out of thin air. This was not symbolism. This was psychological warfare. Because in medieval warfare, knights weren't just soldiers. They were status. They were authority. They were the visible proof that a city could still fight. Saladin's scouts reported it immediately. 60 knights now command the walls. And that report, false as it was, changed everything. But don't misunderstand. This didn't make Jerusalem strong. It made it fragile in a new way. Because now those men had to act like knights. They had to walk the walls in armor that didn't fit. They had to bark orders they didn't understand. They had to face professional soldiers who had been killing since childhood. One of them, a young man named Thomas, vomited inside his helmet the first time he looked down from the battlements. Another froze so badly he had to be dragged away from the parapet while arrows hissed past his head. And Balian saw all of it. Every shaking hand. Every whispered prayer. Every man who knew he was pretending, and feared being exposed. You think that's the worst part? Wait. Because Saladin arrived. When Saladin's army encircled Jerusalem, the sound alone broke men. Drums. Horns. The thunder of hooves. Dust clouds rolled like storms. Green banners stretched as far as the eye could see. 40,000 men. Archers who could split skulls at 100 paces. Infantry hardened by decades of war. Engineers already measuring distances, already calculating angles. And Saladin himself, calm, composed, terrifyingly patient. He rode close enough to see the walls. Close enough to see the knights. And he smiled. Not in joy. In understanding. Because Saladin knew something Balian prayed he wouldn't realize. These knights were a lie. And lies collapse under pressure. The first demand for surrender came quickly. Saladin sent envoys. Polite. Respectful. Spare the city. Spare the people. Open the gates. And Balian answered with steel words. If Jerusalem is taken by force, not one stone will remain holy. Every Muslim shrine will be destroyed. Every Christian will die fighting. It was a bluff. A dangerous one. And Saladin saw straight through it. But here's what history rarely tells you. Saladin hesitated. Not because he doubted victory, but because he understood consequences. Jerusalem was sacred. To both sides. And if Balian meant what he said, even partially, the victory would taste like ash. So Saladin prepared the siege. And that's when hell truly began. The first stones hit the walls like thunder. Mangonels hurled boulders that shattered towers and crushed men into paste. Arrows fell like black rain. Screams echoed through the streets. One civilian woman, Mariam, was hit by a stray stone while carrying water. Her body was never recovered. Just blood, and a broken jug. Inside the city, panic spread faster than fire. The knights were tested immediately. Thomas dropped his spear and ran. Another froze and took an arrow through the thigh, screaming until he passed out. And Balian realized the truth. This plan would either save Jerusalem, or doom it faster than surrender ever could. But he wasn't done yet. Because desperation unlocks ideas that sanity never would. And what Balian planned next made even his own men stare at him like he'd gone mad. You think the fake knights were the lie? No. They were just the beginning. And in the next part, you'll see how Balian turned fear itself into a weapon, and why Saladin's army would soon begin whispering stories they couldn't explain. You think the siege began with stone and steel. It didn't. It began in the mind. Because while Saladin's engineers measured the walls, while his archers tested their bows, while 40,000 men settled into the ritual of killing, Balian was fighting a war no one could see. A war against terror. Inside Jerusalem, fear moved faster than any army. It crept into homes at night. It sat beside mothers as they tried to sleep. It whispered numbers into men's ears. 40,000. 40,000. 40,000. Every knock on a door felt like the end. Every scream echoed longer than it should. And Balian knew something most commanders never grasp. You don't lose a siege when the walls fall. You lose it when people believe they already have. So he did something ruthless. He controlled the story. Every morning, Balian walked the walls. Not in full armor. Not as a distant lord. But as a man who wanted to be seen. He stopped at every tower. He spoke to every group of defenders. He looked men in the eye. And he lied to them. Not small lies. Big ones. He exaggerated victories. He invented reinforcements. He spoke of relief armies that didn't exist. Hold 3 days more, he'd say. Hold 5. Help is coming. And the men believed him. Because believing him was easier than facing the truth. One of the newly made knights, a baker named Guillaume, later said something chilling. I knew he was lying. But I needed him to lie. If he had told us the truth, we would have opened the gates ourselves. This is what leadership looks like when the world is ending. Not honesty, but survival. Now let's talk about Saladin. Because this was not a simple villain facing a desperate city. Saladin was not a brute. He was not a monster. He was a man who had buried brothers. Who had watched cities burn. Who had spent his life balancing mercy against necessity. And Jerusalem was different. Every stone was sacred. Every mistake would echo for generations. That weighed on him. His commanders urged speed. Strike now. Break them. They are weak. But Saladin waited. He watched. He listened. And slowly, something unsettled him. The defenders weren't behaving like a city on the brink. They repaired walls at night. They rotated watch shifts efficiently. They launched controlled counterattacks. This was not the chaos Saladin expected. And that's when the rumors started. Among Saladin's soldiers, whispers spread. They have more knights than we thought. They are preparing something. The city is possessed. Superstition thrives in uncertainty. And Balian fed it. At night, torches appeared on the walls. Too many torches. They moved deliberately. In patterns. The same men would light torches, extinguish them, reappear elsewhere. To the defenders, it was nothing. To Saladin's scouts, it looked like endless manpower. A visual illusion. But it worked. Saladin delayed. Just a little. And in siege warfare, time is blood. But inside Jerusalem, time was running out. Food stores collapsed faster than expected. A loaf of bread became worth a ring. A ring became worth a child's labor. People began to fight each other. One man was beaten to death for stealing water. Balian had him buried quietly. No spectacle. No punishment. Because he understood something horrifying. If he ruled by fear, the city would tear itself apart before Saladin ever entered. So instead, he did something even more dangerous. He forgave. A woman named Isabella lost her husband during the first bombardment. He was crushed while reinforcing a breach. When soldiers brought his body to her, she didn't cry. She screamed. She cursed Balian. She cursed God. She screamed that the city should surrender. The crowd listened. This could have been the moment Jerusalem collapsed from within. Balian approached her. Slowly. He knelt. And he apologized. Not as a lord. As a man. I failed him, he said. And I will fail others. But if we open the gates, I fail everyone. He gave her extra rations. He assigned guards to her home. He did not silence her. And the crowd watched. And something shifted. But don't mistake this for weakness. Balian had a line. And when it was crossed, he became something else entirely. One of the fake knights, an unstable man named Roland, panicked during a night watch. He saw shadows moving in the dark. Thought they were enemies. He raised the alarm. Chaos erupted. Men ran. Arrows were fired. 2 defenders were killed by their own side. In the aftermath, Balian faced a choice. Mercy or discipline. He chose both. Roland was stripped of his knightly title in front of the garrison. Not executed. Not imprisoned. Humiliated. And then assigned to the most dangerous wall section. No escape. No redemption. Just duty. The message was clear. You may be afraid. You may be weak. But if you endanger the city, you will be broken. Now let's shift back outside the walls. Because Saladin was preparing his first real test. A probing assault. Not to take the city. To measure it. Wave after wave of archers advanced. They loosed arrows until the sky darkened. Defenders fell screaming. Blood slicked the stones. And then, the ladders came. Men rushed forward shouting prayers. The defenders panicked. This was the moment everything could end. This was when the fake knights would be exposed. And Balian knew it. So he stepped forward himself. No helmet. Sword drawn. And he stood where everyone could see him. He shouted, "Hold." Not scream. Not rage. Just, hold. And they did. Because when fear peaks, certainty is contagious. The ladders hit the walls. Men climbed. Hands grasped stone slick with blood. And then something unexpected happened. The defenders fought like professionals. Not because they were, but because Balian had drilled them relentlessly. Simple commands. Simple movements. Push. Cut. Step back. They weren't elegant. They weren't heroic. They were efficient. And when the first ladder fell, taking 3 attackers with it, something inside the city broke open. Hope. Real hope. Men cheered. Women wept. Children screamed with joy. For the first time since Hattin, Jerusalem believed it might live. Saladin pulled his men back. He didn't lose many. That wasn't the point. The point was information. And what he learned troubled him. These weren't peasants flailing blindly. This was organized resistance. Someone was teaching them. Someone competent. And that someone was Balian. Saladin's respect grew. So did his concern. Now comes the part history loves to skip. Because it's uncomfortable. Because it reveals how thin the line between salvation and damnation truly was. Inside Jerusalem, there were those who wanted surrender. Not cowards. Pragmatists. Merchants who had seen cities fall. Nobles who knew Saladin's reputation for mercy, conditional mercy. They approached Balian in secret. They begged him to negotiate. To end it now. Balian listened. Then he asked a question that silenced the room. What happens to the poor? No one answered. Because everyone knew. Ransom or slavery. Chains or death. And Balian said something that chilled everyone present. If this city falls, it falls on my terms. That night, one of the men who attended that meeting tried to open a postern gate. He was caught. Dragged before Balian. And Balian did not forgive him. The man was hanged at dawn. Publicly. Silently. No speech. No explanation. Just a body swinging in the wind. And the message reached every corner of the city. There would be no betrayal. Only endurance. But endurance has a cost. By the second week, the city stank of death. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. Flies swarmed. Water fouled. Disease crept in. One of the fake knights, Guillaume the baker, collapsed during watch. Fever. Delirium. He begged to be allowed to die. Balian visited him. Held his hand. Listened as Guillaume whispered something barely audible. I just wanted to be brave, once. Guillaume died before dawn. His armor was reused. Because there was no replacement. And Balian felt it. Every loss. Every lie. Every choice. It was carving pieces out of him. Now here's where everything turns. Because Saladin finally committed. Not a probe. Not a test. A full assault. The bombardment intensified. Stones smashed towers open. Walls cracked. A breach began to form. This was it. This was the end. Defenders faltered. Men wept openly. And Balian realized something horrifying. They couldn't win by force. Not now. Not ever. So he reached for the last weapon left to him. A weapon no one expects in war. Memory. And in the next part, you'll see how Balian weaponized the past. How he forced Saladin to confront a moment that still haunted him. And how that single psychological strike changed the fate of Jerusalem forever. Because what happened next didn't just stop the siege. It rewrote the meaning of victory. You think a siege is decided by stone and steel. It isn't. It's decided by memory. By ghosts. By the moments a man thought he had buried, and suddenly finds standing in front of him again. Because when the walls of Jerusalem began to crack, when the defenders started to break, Balian reached into the past and pulled out something far more dangerous than any weapon. He reminded Saladin who he was. And more importantly, who he never wanted to be again. The breach opened just after dawn. A section of wall collapsed inward with a sound like the earth snapping in half. Dust filled the air. Men vanished beneath falling stone. Through the smoke, Saladin's soldiers surged forward. This wasn't a test anymore. This was the killing blow. Inside Jerusalem, panic exploded. People ran screaming through the streets. Children were trampled. Men dropped weapons and fled toward the citadel. The lie was collapsing. And Balian knew it. He rode to the breach himself. No speeches. No banners. Just a man on a horse staring into the mouth of hell. What he saw made his blood go cold. The defenders weren't just afraid. They were done. This was the moment every commander fears. Not defeat. But collapse. Because once belief dies, nothing can save you. So Balian did something unthinkable. He ordered the defenders to pull back. Not retreat. Withdraw. Deliberately. In full view of the enemy. And Saladin's men paused. Because that's not what broken cities do. Broken cities panic. They scatter. They scream. They don't withdraw in order. And Saladin noticed. The defenders regrouped behind makeshift barricades. Wood. Debris. Broken furniture. Anything that could slow the advance. Balian dismounted. He looked at the men around him. Blooded. Exhausted. Some barely standing. And he told them the truth. Not all of it. But enough. We cannot stop them here, he said. But we can decide how this ends. The men stared at him. Waiting. And then Balian spoke the words that would echo all the way to Saladin's tent. If Jerusalem is taken by force, every Muslim holy site will be destroyed. Every stone will burn. And every Christian will die fighting. This wasn't a threat to Saladin's army. It was a threat to history. And Saladin heard it. The message was carried across the battlefield. Not shouted. Not dramatized. Spoken quietly. Respectfully. And when it reached Saladin, something inside him shifted. Because he had heard these words before. Not from Balian. From himself. Years earlier. In a different city. A different war. A different man. Saladin remembered Jerusalem. Not as a conqueror. But as a student. He remembered standing in Damascus, listening to scholars speak of the city's sanctity. He remembered swearing that when he took Jerusalem, it would not be like 1099. He remembered the stories. The Crusaders slaughtering every man, woman, and child. Blood running through streets. Mosques filled with corpses. Saladin had promised himself he would be different. Better. And now here was Balian, cornered, desperate, holding that promise hostage. Because if the city fell in blood, Saladin's legacy would be stained forever. And Saladin knew something else. Balian wasn't bluffing. A man who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind. Inside Jerusalem, the situation worsened by the hour. The breach widened. Defenders died holding barricades that barely slowed the attackers. One man, an elderly watchman named Peter, stood his ground until he was cut down. He never raised his sword. He just stood there, blocking the path. Because someone had to. Another defender, a teenage boy, picked up a fallen spear and charged screaming into the enemy. He didn't make it 10 steps. But his scream echoed. And that scream did something unexpected. It reached Saladin's men. And it unsettled them. Because this wasn't a city surrendering. This was a city daring them to destroy something sacred. Saladin ordered a halt. Just for a moment. His commanders protested. The city was breaking. Victory was inches away. But Saladin raised his hand. And everything stopped. Dust hung in the air. Wounded men moaned. Silence fell like a weight. And in that silence, Saladin made a decision that shocked everyone. He agreed to negotiate. Now understand what this meant. Saladin was not desperate. He was not losing. He was winning. Negotiating now was a choice. And choices reveal character. Balian rode out to meet him. Not as a conqueror. Not as a victor. As a man with blood on his hands and a city on his back. They met between the lines. Two exhausted figures surrounded by death. And for a moment, they simply looked at each other. No hatred. No shouting. Just understanding. Saladin spoke first. You broke your oath. Balian did not deny it. I did. Saladin's eyes hardened. And you threaten destruction. I do. Saladin waited. Then asked the question that mattered. Why should I believe you? And Balian answered with something terrifying. Because I will burn this city myself before I let it be butchered. This wasn't bravado. This was resignation. And Saladin recognized it. He had seen it in men who had decided to die standing. And he knew. You cannot intimidate a man who has already accepted death. The negotiations began. Slowly. Carefully. Saladin offered mercy. Conditional mercy. Ransom for every soul. Those who could pay would lie free. Those who couldn't would be enslaved. This was normal. Expected. Balian listened. And then he leaned forward. And destroyed the offer. There are tens of thousands here, he said. They cannot all pay. You will enslave women. Children. The old. Saladin said nothing. You will create hatred that will outlive both of us. Still nothing. And then Balian delivered the final blow. If you take Jerusalem by force, I will kill every Muslim prisoner, destroy every holy place, and leave you nothing but ruins. Silence. Long. Heavy. Saladin's commanders shifted uneasily. Because they knew this wasn't a bluff. Here's what history rarely admits. Saladin hesitated because he was afraid. Not of defeat. Of meaning. Because Jerusalem wasn't just another city. It was the symbol. And symbols shape centuries. Finally, Saladin spoke. What do you want? And Balian said the unthinkable. Safe passage for everyone. No ransom. No slavery. Freedom. Saladin laughed. Not mockingly. In disbelief. You ask too much. Balian nodded. I know. And then he said something that changed everything. Then take the city by force. And be remembered like them. He didn't have to say who. They both knew. The massacre. The stain that still poisoned memory. Saladin closed his eyes. Just for a second. And in that second, the siege ended. The terms were negotiated. Not perfect. Not pure. But merciful. Ransoms were reduced. Those who couldn't pay were freed by others. Saladin himself paid for many. The city would surrender peacefully. No massacre. No bloodbath. Jerusalem would live. And the 60 fake knights? They had done their job. But here's the twist no one tells you. Inside Jerusalem, not everyone wanted peace. Some men wanted revenge. They wanted blood. They wanted to die killing. When the surrender was announced, fights broke out. Balian had to threaten his own people to keep order. One man tried to attack a Muslim envoy. Balian cut him down himself. Because peace is fragile. And sometimes, you have to kill to preserve it. On the day the gates opened, silence reigned. No screams. No fires. Just the sound of footsteps. Saladin entered Jerusalem not as a conqueror, but as a custodian. Muslim soldiers were ordered not to harm civilians. Churches were protected. People were escorted safely out. It was unprecedented. And it shocked the world. Balian watched from the walls. His armor was dented. His face gaunt. He had won. And yet, he felt nothing. Because victory had cost him something irretrievable. Faith. Illusion. The comfort of righteousness. He had lied. Threatened. Killed his own. And it had worked. But at what price? As Jerusalem emptied, one of the fake knights, Thomas, the one who had vomited on his first watch, approached Balian. He knelt. I was afraid, he said. I still am. Balian helped him up. So was I. That was all. No speeches. No medals. Just truth. The siege was over. But the story wasn't. Because what followed was even more unsettling. Saladin kept his word. And history rewrote itself. But the cost of mercy was paid quietly. And in the final parts, you'll see what happened to the men who survived. What history chose to forget. And why Balian of Ibelin disappears from legend, despite saving one of the most important cities on earth. Because sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones no one wants to remember. You'd think the story ends when the gates open. It doesn't. That's the lie history sells you. That mercy is clean. That surrender brings relief. That survival feels like victory. The truth is uglier. Because when Jerusalem didn't burn, when the screams didn't come, something else took their place. Silence. And silence is where the real damage lies. The evacuation began at dawn. Long lines of civilians moved through the gates. Barefoot. Hungry. Carrying whatever scraps of life they could hold. Some kissed the ground as they left. Others wouldn't look back. Muslim guards escorted them, not with cruelty, but not with kindness either. This wasn't charity. It was control. Every step away from the city felt like amputation. A woman collapsed just outside the gate, clutching a bundle that didn't move. Her child had died in the night. She hadn't noticed until the morning. A Muslim soldier tried to help her up. She screamed at him. He stepped back, ashamed, confused. This is what mercy looks like after hell. Awkward. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Inside the city, Saladin's officers moved quickly. Orders were strict. No looting. No revenge. No bloodshed. And for the most part, they obeyed. But war leaves residue. A few soldiers couldn't help themselves. A slap here. A stolen ring there. Saladin punished them harshly when he found out. Public beatings. Confiscation. Because he knew something vital. The story of Jerusalem was already spreading. And stories shape empires. Balian remained behind. Most of the population left. But someone had to stay. Someone had to oversee the handover. To account for prisoners. To ensure the terms were honored. That someone was the man who had lied to everyone. Now watch what happens when a leader outlives his purpose. Saladin summoned Balian. Not to threaten him. Not to punish him. To speak. They met again, this time inside Jerusalem. The city felt wrong. Too quiet. Too clean. No siege engines. No screams. Just echoes. Saladin looked around. You defended this well, he said. Balian didn't respond. You saved lives. Still nothing. Saladin studied him more closely. You look disappointed. Balian laughed. A dry, broken sound. I am. Saladin raised an eyebrow. Why? And Balian answered with the kind of honesty that only comes after catastrophe. Because I taught men to die for a lie. And they believed me. Saladin didn't reply. Because there was no answer to that. Saladin offered Balian safe passage. Freedom. Land. Status. Balian declined. He wanted only his family. Nothing more. No reward. No praise. Just to disappear. Saladin granted it. And just like that, the defender of Jerusalem faded into the background. No parade. No songs. History moved on. But the men who had stood on those walls? They didn't move on. They carried the siege with them. Thomas, the fake knight who had almost fled on the first day, survived. He left Jerusalem with nothing but his sword. Years later, he would tell his children about the siege. Not as a victory. As a warning. He would wake up screaming from dreams of ladders scraping stone. He never wore armor again. Isabella, the widow who had screamed at Balian, was ransomed by Saladin himself. She never forgave Balian. But she told people something strange. If he had surrendered sooner, I would be a slave. She hated him. And she thanked him. Both at once. And Saladin? He returned to his tent after the city was secured. He prayed. Longer than usual. Because victory had cost him something too. The certainty of righteousness. He had chosen mercy over annihilation. And while the world praised him for it, he knew something darker. Mercy creates enemies who remember. Now here's the part most people never hear. The lie of the 60 fake knights worked too well. So well that later generations turned it into myth. They stripped it of fear. Of vomit. Of betrayal. They made it clever. Neat. But it wasn't. It was desperate. Ugly. Psychological warfare born from starvation and dread. And it nearly failed, multiple times. If one ladder had held. If one wall had fallen faster. If one rumor had spread differently. Jerusalem would have burned. And Saladin would be remembered very differently. Let me tell you something chilling. There were men in Saladin's army who wanted the massacre. They believed mercy was weakness. They believed Jerusalem should pay for 1099. One commander reportedly said, blood would have washed the stones clean. Saladin silenced him. But those men remembered. And when later wars came, mercy was not always chosen again. History loves clean endings. This one doesn't have one. Because Jerusalem didn't become peaceful. It became quiet. Tense. Like a blade held still. The Crusades didn't end. They intensified. And the memory of this siege became a weapon for both sides. Christians remembered survival. Muslims remembered restraint. Both remembered righteousness. Both were wrong. Balian left Jerusalem without ceremony. No one stopped him. No one followed. He rode away with his family, an anonymous noble among countless others. And that's the most honest ending possible. Because history doesn't reward men who prevent atrocities. It rewards men who cause them. But before we finish, there's one final truth. The most disturbing one. Balian didn't win because he had better soldiers. Or better weapons. He won because he understood something terrifying about human beings. That fear can be shaped. That belief can be manufactured. That honor can be used as a blade. And Saladin, brilliant, disciplined, revered, was human enough to be affected by it. That's not weakness. That's reality. In the final part, we'll strip away the legend completely. You'll see what history chose to hide. Why this siege matters now. And why, after hearing this story, you'll never look at heroic last stands the same way again. Because what saved Jerusalem wasn't courage. It was control. By the time Jerusalem vanished behind Balian's horse, the world had already begun lying about what happened. Because what do you do with a story like this? A city that should have drowned in blood, but didn't. A commander who won by threatening sacrilege. An army of 40,000 halted by 60 men who weren't even real knights. It doesn't fit. So history sanded it down. Smoothed the edges. Turned desperation into genius. Turned fear into faith. And buried the parts that make people uncomfortable. Now we dig them back up. Let's start with the lie that survived the longest. The idea that Balian outplayed Saladin. That he tricked him. Humiliated him. Outwitted a master general. That's not what happened. Balian didn't defeat Saladin. He trapped him morally. And that distinction matters more than any battlefield victory. Because Saladin had every advantage. Men. Weapons. Momentum. Legitimacy. But he had something else too. A reputation. And Balian understood something few commanders ever do. Reputation is leverage. Saladin was not feared because he was cruel. He was feared because he was disciplined. He was admired because he was merciful, selectively. Jerusalem was the stage where that reputation would be sealed forever. And Balian forced him into a corner where every option carried a cost. Take the city by force? Win militarily. Lose morally. Negotiate. Preserve sanctity. Risk looking weak. Saladin chose the only path that didn't poison his legacy. But make no mistake. That choice haunted him. Years later, Saladin's own chroniclers struggled with Jerusalem. They praised the mercy. They praised the restraint. But between the lines, something else leaks through. A discomfort. Because Jerusalem was the moment Saladin realized something terrifying. That power does not always belong to the stronger side. Sometimes. It belongs to the side with nothing left to lose. And that's the part history really doesn't like. Because it forces a question no one wants to answer. If Balian hadn't threatened destruction. If he hadn't been willing to burn holy sites. If he hadn't weaponized terror. Would Jerusalem have survived? Probably not. And that makes him hard to celebrate. Now let's talk about the men. The so-called fake knights. Because here's the truth. Most of them didn't survive long after the siege. Not from wounds. From aftermath. They went home, if home still existed. They tried to return to ordinary life. And they couldn't. One former knight reportedly beat a man nearly to death for insulting Jerusalem. Another joined a mercenary band and died nameless on a road in Anatolia. Thomas, the one who almost fled, lived the longest. He lived quietly. Avoided churches. Avoided crowds. Because whenever he heard bells, he smelled blood again. This is what last stands do to people. They don't create heroes. They create survivors who don't recognize themselves anymore. And Balian? He lived. Which is almost worse. He was not executed. Not exiled. Not honored. Just forgotten. He appears briefly in later records. Land disputes. Minor diplomacy. Nothing heroic. No glory. And that tells you everything. Because history remembers conquerors. It remembers massacres. It remembers victories you can point to. But how do you remember a man whose greatest achievement was stopping something from happening? You don't. You let him fade. Here's another truth that rarely gets said out loud. Jerusalem didn't stay peaceful because of mercy. It stayed peaceful because everyone remembered how close it came to annihilation. Fear lingered. Like radiation. Invisible. Persistent. Every generation inherited it. And that fear shaped the next century of warfare in the region. Negotiation became sharper. Threats became subtler. Symbolic violence became currency. The siege of Jerusalem taught leaders something invaluable. You don't always need to win. You just need to make the cost of winning unbearable. Now let's dismantle the title of this story. Humiliated Saladin. That word feels good, doesn't it? It feels satisfying. But it's wrong. Saladin was not humiliated. He was confronted, forced to choose between power and principle. And that choice, more than any defeat, reveals character. Balian didn't humiliate Saladin. He exposed him. And Saladin chose mercy. That's not weakness. That's humanity under pressure. But here's the darkest part. The part almost no one acknowledges. Balian's success depended on the memory of a massacre. Without that bloodstain on history, his threat would have meant nothing. So, in a way, Jerusalem was saved in 1187 because it had been butchered in 1099. Violence echoing across generations. That's the real inheritance of the Crusades. Not land. Not faith. Trauma. So when people talk about heroic last stands, about noble defenders, about courage against impossible odds, remember this. Jerusalem wasn't saved by bravery. It was saved by a man willing to threaten horror, and another man unwilling to repeat it. That's not a fairy tale. That's a warning. Now you know the version of this story most people never hear. The one without clean heroes. Without pure villains. Without comforting certainty. You know that 60 fake knights didn't win a battle. They survived a moral stalemate. You know that Saladin didn't spare Jerusalem out of kindness. He spared it because history was watching. And you know that Balian of Ibelin wasn't a legend. He was a man who stared into the abyss and decided the world didn't need another massacre. That knowledge puts you in a very small group. Because most people prefer myths. You don't. You stayed. You listened. You saw what really happened. And once you've seen that, you'll never hear the word victory the same way again.